Sandy to radiology. Sandy to radiology. That's what Dr. Caldwell would call her. Not her name. Never her name. Just a reminder, broadcast through the hospital intercom during shift change, that she was less than the badge clipped to her scrubs, less than the physicians who walked past her station without acknowledgement, less than the residents who questioned her vital sign readings even when the monitors confirmed every number she'd called. They didn't know. They had no idea. 20 years ago, Rachel Torres had led a combat surgical unit through sustained mortar fire in Bagram, maintaining a 96% save rate in a place where most surgeons would have frozen. The Pentagon had buried every record of her existence to protect generals with stars on their shoulders and decisions that had cost 14 lives. Now she restocked for lines at Seattle General in scrubs 2 sizes too big, her efficiency so quiet that the nurses' station practically forgot she was there between shifts. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous hymn above cracked linoleum as Rachel arrived at 0600, 30 minutes before rounds began. The parking lot had still been wet, it had rained hard the night before, the kind of rain that smelled like machine oil and distant traffic. She'd driven a 2011 Honda Civic with a check engine light that had been blinking for 8 months. She didn't fix it. Things that called attention got attention. Her locker was the smallest one, tucked in the back corner of the nurse's break room behind 3 defunct coffee makers and a bulletin board covered in faded postings from 2019. Inside, she kept 3 pairs of scrubs, a water bottle, and a single photograph sealed in a plastic bag. The photo showed her surgical team, 4 surgeons and 6 field nurses in desert camouflage, standing outside a tent marked with a red cross. Everyone's face except hers had been redacted by a government-issue black marker. She'd been ordered to hide it. She carried it anyway, pressed against the bottom of her locker like a prayer. Around her neck, hidden beneath the scrubs, was a dog tag on a broken chain. The chain had snapped in 2004 during a helicopter extraction in Kandahar. The tag itself was stamped with a name that wasn't Rachel Torres, a name that technically didn't exist anymore, erased from the Army Medical Corps roster, from the Pentagon's personnel database, from every official record that had once proven she'd served. A lieutenant colonel had met her in a windowless room at Landstuhl Medical Center and explained the situation with the kind of precision that comes from delivering impossible orders. 14 soldiers were dead because of decisions made above her pay grade. Investigations would follow. Congressional questions would be asked. And Major Rachel Torres would cease to exist to protect the chain of command. The dog tag was the only proof she'd ever lived that life. She wore it beneath her collar every shift, a secret weight against her sternum that reminded her of who she actually was, even when the hospital treated her like a civilian with no credentials and a tendency to overstep. The morning shift began like every other morning at Seattle General. Rachel moved through the corridors with the kind of invisible efficiency that only comes from years of training in high-stress environments where wasted motion could cost lives. She'd learned early, back in Kandahar, back when she was Major Torres instead of Temp Torres, that the best way to survive was to become part of the background. She restocked supply carts. She logged vital signs. She answered call lights. She never interrupted the physicians. She never offered opinions that hadn't been solicited. She was the kind of nurse that hospitals relied on completely and acknowledged rarely, the type that attending doctors would struggle to identify in a photograph even though she'd been present during their rounds for 8 months. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that came from having sutured arterial vessels while the ground shook from explosion concussions, but she kept that precision small and quiet, limiting herself to routine tasks that didn't require explanation. Dr. James Caldwell arrived at 0730 for morning rounds. He moved through the ICU and surgical recovery unit with the bearing of a man who understood his position in the hospital hierarchy with absolute clarity: chief of surgery, 3 published papers, a country club membership, and enough social capital with the hospital board that his decisions rarely faced scrutiny. He was 58, built like someone who'd spent his 20s in rugby and had maintained the bearing into middle age. His voice was calibrated to sound conversational while remaining fundamentally dismissive, a tone he perfected over decades of addressing residents, nurses, and patients with identical levels of benevolent condescension. He wore a Rolex, though not ostentatiously, just visible enough during rounds that the residents would notice. The watch cost more than Rachel's annual rent. The patient in Bay 4 was Marcus Chen, Navy SEAL, admitted 3 days prior with chest pain and elevated troponin levels. He was 23 years old, athletic build, the kind of patient who sat up in bed and insisted he felt fine despite what the monitors said. His chart indicated unexplained tachycardia. His heart rate had been running elevated since admission, spiking to 118 at rest, settling to 105 when he was calm. The cardiology workup had been incomplete. Caldwell's plan was discharge. Rachel saw it in the chart during her 0645 nursing documentation review, and something in her chest locked up tight. She was at the medication dispensary refilling syringes when she saw Caldwell approach Marcus's bay during rounds. The team was small, a resident, 2 medical students, and Caldwell moving like a general inspecting troops. Rachel could hear the murmur of conversation from the hallway. Caldwell's voice was clear and carrying, the way voices become in hospitals when someone speaks with the assumption that they're the most important person in the room. Young, healthy, excellent cardiovascular baseline. The troponin elevation is likely demand ischemia from the initial chest wall injury. We can clear him. He has places to be. The resident, a nervous man named Torres actually, no relation, was nodding, writing orders. One of the medical students was taking notes. Nobody was questioning the plan. Rachel moved without thinking about it. She collected Marcus's chart. She walked to the bay entrance, her footsteps quiet on the institutional tile. The chart was warm in her hands. Her eye stayed down, addressing Caldwell with the respectful deference that had been drilled into her for 8 months of temp shifts. Doctor, I wanted to mention, his heart rate is elevated again this morning. 109 at rest. The troponin levels haven't declined as expected. Cardiology still hasn't cleared him for. She didn't finish. Caldwell's expression had shifted, and she recognized the look immediately. It was the look of someone whose authority had been questioned in front of subordinates. His smile didn't waver, but his eyes did. They narrowed to surgical precision. I'm sorry, he said, each word articulated with the care of a man placing them like scalpel cuts. Are you the attending physician on this case? Rachel said nothing. She held the chart steady. She didn't break eye contact, but she didn't escalate it either, a careful middle ground that acknowledged hierarchy without accepting humiliation. I didn't think so. We have protocols for a reason, Miss Torres. Let the clinical decisions remain with the physicians. He took the chart from her hands with the kind of gentle firmness that made the gesture feel inevitable. Discharge orders stand. Thank you for your input. The rounds moved forward. The team followed Caldwell to the next bay. Rachel was already walking in the opposite direction, her movements efficient and final. But in that moment, for perhaps 2 seconds, she'd stood close enough to Marcus Chen to register something her brain had been searching for since he'd arrived 3 days ago with a Navy identification card and a request for a private room. The scar. Below his left ear, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. A jagged 3-centimeter line of tissue that had healed in the specific way a wound heals when it's been stitched by someone's steady hands in rubble, under fire, with blood and dust in the light and the sound of gunfire echoing off concrete walls. She knew that scar. She'd made that scar. She'd pulled an 8-year-old boy from a compound collapse in Kandahar 20 years ago, his tiny hand clutching her sleeve as she'd worked through mortar fire, his small body limp and unresponsive as she'd screened him for injuries. A laceration below the left ear. She'd sutured it with 4.0 silk, 3 interrupted stitches, working by headlamp in a medical tent that had smelled like antiseptic and diesel exhaust and fear. The boy had been terrified but breathing. She'd written his name in her surgical log, a log that had been classified and destroyed, and held his hand until the medevac helicopter arrived. That boy was now a Navy SEAL with unexplained tachycardia, sitting in a hospital bay, with no idea that the quiet temp nurse who'd just questioned his discharge was the surgeon who'd saved his life. And he was about to be sent home with incomplete cardiology clearance by a physician whose primary concern was moving patients through the system, not keeping them alive. Rachel logged the vital signs in the patient record. She documented the conversation. She did what the protocol demanded and nothing more. but her left knee, the one that had shattered in an IED blast outside Kandahar and been reconstructed with titanium pins and surgical plate, began to tremble slightly as she walked to the supply closet to refill the crash carts. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 18 years of muscle memory compressed into her nervous system, screaming at her to act, to pull Marcus Chen's chart again, to call cardiology directly, to do what every instinct from every year of command experience demanded. But that Rachel Torres had ceased to exist in an official capacity. That Rachel Torres wasn't authorized to make decisions. That Rachel Torres was just a nurse, and just a nurse didn't have the authority to override an attending physician's clinical judgment, not even when she could read vital signs like a second language and not even when she could see the danger in a scar below an ear that no one else had noticed. She grabbed the crash cart and began restocking it with the mechanical precision of muscle memory. Amiodarone. Epinephrine. For kits. Airway equipment. 14-gauge angiocath needles. Her hands moved like they were piloted by someone else, someone who understood the architecture of resuscitation at a cellular level. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere down the hallway, Marcus Chen's discharge papers were probably being prepared. And Rachel Torres, invisible as the hospital's infrastructure, continued her shift as if nothing had changed. But it had. The moment she'd recognized that scar, everything had changed. 2 hours after Rachel questioned Chen's discharge, an overhead page crackled through every floor of Seattle General like electricity through copper wire. Sandy to radiology. Sandy to radiology. The intercom died. Silence bloomed across the third-floor corridor like blood spreading through water. Rachel froze mid-step between rooms 314 and 316, a medication cart wedged against her hip. Nurses glanced at clipboards. An orderly smirked. The nickname was new, invented yesterday, whispered into the charge nurse's ear by Dr. Caldwell himself. Sandy. Rough around the edges. Need smoothing out. By lunch, everyone had heard it. By 1300 hours, the name had spread through radiology, through ICU, down to the emergency department where the techs laughed while they processed her request for a chest X-ray. She'd walked past a supply station and heard 2 residents trading it like currency. Where's Sandy? 3rd floor, probably messing something up. Rachel set down her medication cart in the physician's lounge at 1345. Caldwell sat alone, reading something on his phone, a cup of coffee cooling beside him. She kept her voice level, professional, the way she'd been trained to speak to officers who held her career in their hands. Dr. Caldwell, I go by Rachel. He didn't look up. His fingers swiped across the screen with the precision of someone accustomed to never being interrupted. Sandy suits you better. Friendlier. Patients respond to warmth. The word warmth came out like contempt, like she was a piece of equipment that had failed some inspection. She took one measured breath. Just one. In through her nose, the scent of antiseptic and his cologne mixing with the stale coffee smell that permeated the lounge. She felt a tear form at the corner of her left eye, not from sadness, but from something older, something that lived in the muscle memory of 20 years of helplessness. She wiped it with her thumb without breaking eye contact. You should have listened about the seal. Caldwell laughed then, a short, dismissive sound like glass breaking. He still didn't look up. 2 days later, he cornered her in the 3rd-floor supply closet during shift change. The door clicked shut behind her with the finality of a prison cell locking. The shelves were stacked with gauze, with saline bags, with the mundane machinery of saving lives. His voice dropped to a surgical coldness, the kind of precision that carved through skin. Your performance review flags multiple protocol deviations. Questioning physician orders. Accessing charts outside your assignment scope. He stood close enough that she could see the thread count of his shirt, could smell the expensive cologne that probably cost more than her monthly rent. I have 3 board members who golf with me twice a month, Rachel. Mercy General's CEO goes to the same club. Temp agencies don't ask questions when contracts terminate early. They just move on to the next warm body. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Quiet threats were always more effective than screaming. She'd learned that in Bagram, in compound collapse scenarios where the command had come down as barely a whisper, make it disappear. All of it. She stood perfectly still, counted to 3 in her head, a tactical pause, nothing more, and responded in the same flat register she used during trauma assessments. "Is that all, Doctor?" He leaned closer. His breath smelled of expensive mints and the particular stench of confidence that came from never being questioned. "You're a temp nurse who barely finished community college. Stay in your lane, Sandy, or you won't have a lane." The door opened behind him. He left without waiting for an answer. That Friday at 1645 hours, during the busiest shift change when the parking lot was full of staff heading home, Caldwell paged her to the ambulance bay over the loudspeaker. Not a quiet call. Not a phone conversation. A broadcast. 12 nurses and 4 residents heard it. They watched as he demoted her to night intake effective immediately, citing her inability to work collaboratively with the care team. His voice carried across the asphalt like a verdict. Rachel's hands didn't shake. Her breathing remained steady. But one tear escaped, just one, the kind that fell before she could stop it. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, and she said clearly enough for everyone to hear, her voice steady as a surgical laser, "I hope you're right about Jen's discharge, Dr. Caldwell. I really do." She didn't go home that night. She went to a rain-soaked bus stop on 5th and Madison, the kind of stop that existed in every American city, where the shelter was broken and the bench was wet and nobody asked questions. She sat there with a cardboard box balanced on her hip. Inside were 3 things. A cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse," a gift from an ER tech she'd trained 6 months ago before being demoted. A dying succulent in a terracotta pot, brown at the edges, refusing to thrive no matter how much water she gave it. And a photograph, the kind printed from a phone at a CVS, showing 7 men and women in Army Medical Corps desert camouflage, standing in front of a mud brick compound with mountains rising behind them like teeth. She was the one on the left, her arm around a young specialist named Rodriguez. They'd been together for 3 tours. The last time she'd seen Rodriguez was in 2004. She'd been forbidden from contacting him. Forbidden from confirming he was alive. Forbidden from everything. The single dog tag on a broken chain around her neck was the only proof she'd ever served. The name stamped on it wasn't hers. It belonged to someone else, someone the Pentagon had erased from every database. Someone who'd been buried in the record of a failed extraction, a Black Ops mission that had gone sideways in ways that made grown men classified. The dog tag was cold against her skin, the way it had been for 20 years. She'd slept with it. She'd showered with it. She'd trained nurses, performed procedures, and saved lives while wearing a name that belonged to a dead woman. The rain hammered down like applause on the shelter's broken plastic roof. A bus passed without stopping, she hadn't been waiting for it. Around her, San Diego hummed with Friday night energy. Restaurants filled. Bars opened. People celebrated the end of the week. Rachel sat on the wet bench with a cardboard box containing the only physical evidence of her life, and she waited for something. She didn't know what. Just something. The rain fell harder. The broken chain around her neck felt heavier. And somewhere in the hospital 8 blocks away, Marcus Chen was sleeping in a room that had been cleared for discharge, his elevated cardiac markers already fading from memory, his scar hidden beneath bandages, his 8-year-old hand no longer clutching at her sleeve. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence. The absolute absence of response. The void where someone should have fought back, where someone should have screamed, where someone should have let the world know that Major Rachel Torres, holder of a silver star and 2 Purple Hearts, had been erased not by the Pentagon but by a man with golf privileges and contempt in his eyes. The rain fell on the broken shelter and on the cardboard box and on the dog tag with a dead woman's name. And Rachel Torres, whoever she was allowed to be on any given Tuesday, sat very still and waited for the world to end. The bus shelter leaked. Rain found the seams in the metal frame and dripped onto the cardboard box balanced on Rachel's lap, and she didn't move. Didn't shift the weight. didn't protect the photo of her surgical team from the slow seep of moisture creeping across the corners. The dog tag hung beneath her scrubs, cold against her collarbone, a name that wasn't hers thumping against her ribs with every breath. She was still wearing her badge. They hadn't asked for it back yet. A hospital text arrived at 14:22. Marcus Chen, age 28, presenting to Seattle General's main entrance with acute tachycardia and chest pain. Son of visiting family. Patient refusing transport. Already waiting in the parking lot. She didn't think. Didn't calculate the risk or the logic. Rachel stood, left the cardboard box on the bench, and moved toward the sound of sirens like a compass needle finding north. The parking lot smelled like hot asphalt and diesel exhaust from the ambulances idling near the bay doors. Marcus was still conscious when she reached him, sitting on the curb in a UCLA medical school t-shirt, his breathing rapid and shallow, the scar beneath his left ear exactly where she'd stitched it 20 years ago in a compound collapse in Kandahar when he was 8 years old, and her hands were the only steady thing in the mortar fire. A family member, his mother, probably, was screaming his name over and over, the way mothers do when they can feel their child slipping toward the edge of something they don't have a name for. Rachel knelt beside him without introducing herself. Marcus Chen. He looked up. 19-year-old eyes in a 28-year-old body. Yeah, that's. We're going inside. Now. Your heart's working too hard and we need to know why. She wasn't using her temp nurse voice. The command voice had slipped out, the one she'd used in field hospitals when there was no time for permission, only outcomes. Can you walk? He nodded and she helped him to his feet, her hand on his spine, feeling the rapid percussion of his heartbeat echoing through muscle and bone. His mother followed, still screaming questions. Rachel didn't answer. Just moved him through the ER doors and into Dr. Caldwell's world, where a temp nurse had no authority to speak, no standing to question, no value except the shifts she filled. Caldwell was in trauma too when Rachel handed Marcus off to the intake nurse with a single instruction, full cardiac workup. He needs an EKG now, not after triage. The intake nurse, new, maybe 2 months, looked at Rachel like she'd spoken in a language nobody used anymore. Rachel was already turning away when Caldwell emerged, reading a chart, and his eyes caught hers for exactly 1 second before she became invisible again. By 14:40, Marcus was in a bed with leads across his chest and a monitor displaying the frantic electrical signature of a heart in distress. The EKG showed nothing immediately catastrophic. The labs were still running. Caldwell ordered a discharge by phone at 14:45, citing anxiety, recommending outpatient cardiology follow-up, noting in the chart that the patient's presentation was consistent with panic disorder. Rachel was restocking a supply cart in the hallway when she heard the discharge order. Didn't respond. Didn't react. Just finished placing the rolls of gauze in their precise rows and moved to the next task because that's what temp nurses did. That's what you did when you'd already been told your concerns didn't matter. That's what you did when you were already scheduled to disappear. The earthquake hit at 14:47. It wasn't a rumble that built slowly. It was a violent snap, the kind of seismic violence that doesn't announce itself, it just rewrites the world. The floor bucked. The supply cart toppled. Fluorescent lights swung like pendulums and then one went dark as the fixture cracked. Overhead, the sound of something catastrophic, metal screaming against concrete, the deep groan of a structure being torn. Rachel was on her feet before the first aftershock, moving toward the sound instead of away from it because that's what you did when you understood that the people who were screaming needed someone who could think. The East Wing surgical suite had partially collapsed. A massive steel beam had come down across Trauma 7, the room where Dr. Patel had been closing a ruptured spleen on a 34-year-old construction worker. The beam had pinned Patel's lower body to the floor. Her face was ash-gray. Her lips were already bluish. Blood, so much blood, was pooling beneath the edge of the beam. I need a scalpel and clamps. Now. Rachel was already kneeling beside Patel's exposed abdomen, her hands moving with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this in conditions far worse than rubble and darkness. A nurse frozen in the doorway stammered something about the crash cart being buried under debris. Rachel didn't hesitate. She yanked a fire axe from the wall mount, the red paint bright against the dust, and used the blunt end to pry up the beam enough for another nurse to drag Patel's torso clear by the arms. 6 inches. That's all they got. Enough. The scalpel came from a scattered supply tray. The blade was clean. Rachel's hands moved on their own, cut through intercostal muscle with the precision of a surgeon who'd done this under mortar fire in a command tent with wounded stacked 3 deep. 45 seconds. 58 seconds. 90 seconds total, and the pericardial sac was open and she could see the reason for the massive blood loss, a severed femoral artery, the kind of wound that kills in minutes if the pressure isn't controlled. She clamped it with her bare hands when the first clamp slipped, held pressure with fingers that had learned their craft in a desert her government said she'd never been to. The concrete dust rained down with every aftershock, coating her shoulders, her hair, the wound she was holding together with nothing but anatomy and will. "Where the hell did you learn that?" One of the residents was staring. His voice was somewhere between awe and terror. Rachel didn't answer. "Pressure bandage. Now." "Vascular needs a 2.0 silk tie, satin sky clamp from the..." She stopped herself. She'd almost ordered from memory. Almost revealed the field hospital protocols that civilians weren't supposed to know. "From wherever it is you keep them." A paramedic appeared with equipment. Without thinking, he snapped to attention and began following her orders, her voice like a tank idling in a garage, steady and inevitable and designed by people who understood that noise was a luxury you couldn't afford. She extracted her hands from Patel's wound at 16:12 and let the vascular surgeon take over, who'd just arrived and was already moving into the space she'd cleared, the space she'd prepared, the space she'd held stable for the 8 minutes that separated life from death. Rachel walked to the scrub sink on legs that didn't shake. The water was cold against her hands, cold enough to shock her skin, to remind her that she was still inside a civilian body wearing civilian scrubs bearing a civilian name. She scrubbed methodically. Watched the blood spiral down the drain. Didn't think about what she'd just done or what it meant or how a temp nurse had performed techniques that required training nobody thought she possessed. Caldwell arrived at 16:05. She saw him through the crack in the door, standing in the rubble-strewn hallway, surveying the controlled chaos, watching Rachel's hands come out of Patel's leg, watching the residents who'd formed an instinctive chain passing supplies like they'd been trained to respond to her voice. His face went still. Then he turned to the charge nurse and said quietly, so quietly Rachel almost didn't hear it through the door, "Document every action Nurse Torres took. Every single one." Rachel met his eyes over Patel's body. Knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't panic. This wasn't a man losing control. This was a man understanding that he'd just witnessed something that threatened his authority, his standing, his careful architecture of dismissal and hierarchy. He was already preparing the narrative. Already building the documentation. Already constructing the case that would erase what he'd seen. By 1747, exactly 3 hours after the earthquake, the hospital administrator's hands were shaking as she delivered the termination notice. Rachel read it once. Unauthorized procedures. Practicing beyond scope of practice. Patient endangerment. An emergency complaint filed with the state medical board. The temp agency's contract terminated effective immediately. Everything documented. Everything dated. Caldwell had been efficient. Rachel would give him that much. He'd made 3 phone calls, one to the state board, one to the temp agency, one to hospital legal, and those calls had done the work of dismantling her 8 months in approximately 180 seconds. "I'm sorry," the administrator said. "Dr. Caldwell's concerns are legitimate. The procedures you performed, we have to take them seriously." Rachel folded the termination notice and tucked it into the pocket of her scrubs, next to the dog tag. Said nothing. Her voice had already been classified once. She wasn't about to give these people the satisfaction of hearing it break. At 22:30, after she'd finished her shift because Dr. Patel was still in surgery and Rachel needed to know the outcome, the ICU nurse pulled her aside in the hallway. Patel's stable. They're saying she'll keep the leg. Whatever you did in that rubble, the nurse stopped. There were no words for it. There was only the fact of a woman breathing who shouldn't be breathing, a limb attached that should have been lost, a survival margin measured in minutes and nerve. Rachel nodded once. Didn't say anything. Just walked out through the same doors where Marcus had arrived at 14:22, and the rain was waiting, and her cardboard box was still sitting on the bus shelter bench with the photo of her surgical team getting slower and more waterlogged by the minute. She was 3 blocks away when she realized she still hadn't cried. Not during the emergency. Not during the termination. Not standing in the rain with her entire 8-month existence folded into a notice someone else had written. The trembling wasn't fear. It was something older. Something that came from knowing you'd just saved a life with your hands, and that same act of saving had marked you for erasure. The dog tag swung against her collarbone. A dead woman's name. Still wearing it. Still waiting for someone to realize who she was before the world forgot again. Within 3 hours, before the dust had even settled on the Eastern Wing, before families finished making calls to say their loved ones had survived, Dr. Caldwell sat in his office with the door closed and began making decisions that would feel, in that moment, like protection. The earthquake had stopped at 14:24. By 17:52, he was dialing the hospital attorney. His voice came steady and rehearsed, the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. I need to file an emergency complaint against a temporary nursing staff member. Rachel Torres. She performed unauthorized surgical procedures during the earthquake crisis, thoracotomy, without proper credentials, without supervision. I have 3 witnesses. This constitutes practicing beyond her scope of licensure and patient endangerment. I need it documented before the state board gets ahead of us. The attorney on the other end, Patricia Hennessy, senior counsel for Seattle General's Risk Management Division, did not hesitate. She'd worked with Caldwell for 11 years. She knew how this worked. I'll file the emergency report with the state medical board within the hour. We'll cite the specific procedures, documented and authorized practice, and recommend immediate suspension pending investigation. Do you want to press for criminal charges? Not yet, Caldwell said. Let's let the board move first. Make it look procedural. At 17:58, he called the state medical board directly. A junior administrator took the call and logged it into the system while he spoke. Unauthorized procedures, no licensure verification, patient endangerment in a disaster scenario. The words hung in the air like surgical instruments being catalogued. Each one a small blade. By 18:03, Caldwell was on the phone with Derek Vance at Staffing Plus, the temp agency that had placed Rachel 6 months ago. Vance answered on the second ring. He always did when Caldwell called. The hospital generated more than $2 million in staffing revenue annually through his agency. I'm terminating Rachel Torres's contract effective immediately, Caldwell said. Document it as performance deficiency and scope violations. I don't want her name in any database that future employers can access. Vance, who had placed Rachel in 30 hospitals over 8 years without a single complaint, said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, that's going to require paperwork. If she contests it? She won't, Caldwell interrupted. And if she does, the state board will back us. I've already filed. Vance typed something. The sound of keystrokes came through the phone line, each one a small death. Consider it done. Terminated for cause, documentation sealed. She'll get her final check, severance paperwork, and nothing else. Caldwell hung up. Sat back in his chair. Waited. The next morning, the hospital administrator, David Chen, 61, 15 years in the role, arrived to find Patricia Hennessy's email already sitting in his inbox, time-stamped 22:14 the previous evening. The emergency complaint. The state board filing. The recommendations for Rachel's immediate suspension and contract termination. Chen read it twice. He did not know what Rachel Torres had actually done during the earthquake. He had not seen her perform the procedure. He had only Caldwell's statement, carefully worded, legally airtight. 3 witnesses. Unauthorized practice. Patient endangerment. The language was perfect. It was precise. It sounded like someone who had already consulted with counsel. By 9:30 Wednesday morning, Chen initiated the internal investigation protocol. A formal letter went to Rachel at her apartment address on file, requesting she cease clinical duties pending review. The letter was copied to State Medical Board. Copied to the staffing agency. Copied to the hospital's legal team. Each copy was a small institutional weight pressing down, the kind of pressure that accumulated silently until it became impossible to move. Rachel did not receive the letter because she was still at the hospital, finishing her shift. She had stayed past 10 p.m. to confirm Dr. Patel's status. The resident with the severed femoral artery was stable, transferred to the ICU at 21:06, both legs intact, blood transfused and monitored. The surgical team had taken her bleeding and her need and transformed it into survival. Rachel had watched from the doorway as the ICU nurse, not her, initiated post-operative protocols. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The monitors beeped in their steady, living cadence. The patient's wife had looked at Rachel over her shoulder before going into the ICU room, eyes carrying a weight of gratitude that Rachel had not asked for. At 22:31, Rachel logged out of the hospital system for the last time, though she did not know it yet. She walked to the staff locker room on the 3rd floor, the one where nurses kept their civilian clothes and personal items in a space the size of a gym closet. Her locker was number 47. She opened it with a key that was already becoming foreign in her hand. Inside was the life she had borrowed. A cracked ceramic mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded blue letters. A dying succulent in a plastic pot, she had been watering it for 4 months despite the yellowing leaves because something in her refused to let it die. A photograph, 4 by 6 inches, showing 12 surgeons in blood-stained surgical gear standing in front of a tent with an American flag painted on the canvas. The photograph had been taken at Bagram, and every face in it belonged to someone she had been forbidden to contact. The order had come from a lieutenant colonel in a windowless room at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, 3 days after the extraction. He had placed a file on the table in front of her, 1 file, no copies, classified red. Operation Nightfall resulted in 14 casualties. It did not happen. Major Rachel Torres does not exist in any database. You will receive a new identity, a nursing license under that identity, and references that will not verify if called. Do not attempt contact with military personnel. Do not disclose your service history. Do not return to civilian army facilities. You disappeared in 2004 to protect officers who were following orders above your pay grade. She had nodded. Taken the file. Walked out a different person. Now she held that photograph and felt the weight of 18 years condensed into paper and chemical emulsion. She found a cardboard box in the break room, the kind that had held surgical supplies before the earthquake cleaned out half the stockroom. She placed the mug in first, carefully, as if it might break. The succulent went next, the soil shifting in its pot. The photograph she held for a moment longer, seeing the faces she could not name anymore, the hands that had worked alongside hers through mortar fire and blood loss and decisions that killed people. Then she placed it in the box, face down. Around her neck, beneath her scrubs, hung the dog tag on its broken chain. She did not reach for it. She could feel it, cold against her sternum like a second heartbeat. The tag was stamped with a name that belonged to someone else, the someone else she had become. Rachel Torres. But not the Rachel Torres who had existed. She carried the box to the employee parking lot. The rain had started again, the kind of rain that came after earthquakes in Southern California, as if the earth itself was weeping. By the time she reached the bus stop 3 blocks away, the one on Ash Street where the shelter was broken and the bench was wet, the bottom of the box had begun to soften. Water was finding its way through the cardboard, the kind of slow and inevitable destruction that happened to things not meant to last. A bus passed. It did not stop. She was not at a stop zone. She was standing in the rain with a disintegrating box and a dog tag that belonged to someone the Pentagon had erased. The fluorescent lights of a nearby convenience store hummed and flickered across her face. She did not cry. She did not tremble. She stood with the composure of someone who had already lost everything and been rebuilt by institutional force into something new, which meant loss was no longer terrifying, it was simply data. Information. Pain is data. But that wasn't the worst part. While Rachel stood in the rain, Marcus Chen was waking in the ICU with morphine fog clearing like clouds from a valley, and memory, sharp, surgical, impossible to deny, are snapping back into focus. The explosion. The sound of rebar screaming as it twisted. The woman with steady hands, hands that moved like muscle memory incarnate, like someone who had done this 1,000 times before. She had been singing to him in Spanish while pulling metal from his chest, a lullaby his mother sang, somehow, impossibly, this stranger knew. She had found the scar below his left ear where shrapnel had grazed him, and she had stitched it while mortar fire shook the compound walls. She was 8 years old in Kandahar, and she was 29 years old here in Seattle, and she had worn the face of a temp nurse 3 days ago when she had tried to save his life again. He remembered everything. Not because of the explosion. Because of her hands. Marcus Chen had become a Navy SEAL because of those hands. Because a woman had worked through chaos to keep him breathing, and something in him understood, even at 8 years old, that some people were built for the work of saving. He had spent 20 years becoming someone who could do that work too, and now he was lying in a hospital bed with his superior officer's number on his phone and one question burning like a fever: where was Major Rachel Torres? Because that's what he called out to the surgeon who had saved him, before memory had been redacted, before the Pentagon had stepped in with erasure and silence and the kind of institutional forgetting that required meetings in windowless rooms. He had called her Major. And she had looked at him with eyes that had seen too much and said, "Shush. You're safe now. She's got you." 3 calls. 1 to his commanding officer. 1 to a SEAL teammate who worked intelligence at the Pentagon. 1 text to a friend with access to buried records. By midnight, they had found it. The operation that did not exist. The personnel file that had been scrubbed. The 14 casualties that had been buried. The major who had been given a new name and told to disappear. By 4 o'clock Friday morning, Marcus Chen had made another call to a Black Hawk pilot at Naval Air Station North Island who owed him a favor. At 5:27, the helicopter descended toward Seattle General's rooftop helipad like judgment, and Commander James Harding, 42 years old, chest full of ribbons from 23 years of service, eyes like someone who had seen exactly what war looked like, strode out of the stairwell at 5:52 with Marcus Chen in a hospital gown beside him, both of them moving with a kind of purpose that made air pressure change. The rotor wash hit first. Not the helicopter, the sound. The percussion of it shattered across the rooftop and rattled the windows on the top 3 floors of Seattle General at 5:52 on a Friday morning. Nurses looked up from medication carts. A resident froze mid-sentence in the ICU. The sound of a Black Hawk didn't belong here. It belonged to combat zones and disaster sites, to places where protocols dissolved and hierarchy meant nothing. This sound meant someone was coming who outranked everyone in the building. The doors to the ICU burst open at 5:57. Commander James Harding entered first, 42 years old, chest covered in ribbons from 23 years of service, shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. His dress uniform was navy blue, immaculate, the kind of uniform that made regular clothes look like pajamas. He moved with the terrifying fluid precision of a man who had walked into rooms where people died, and that presence made the air pressure change. Behind him, still in a hospital gown, was Marcus Chen. 28 years old. Navy SEAL. Cardiac unit patient. The young man who had woken at 3 a.m. remembering everything, the explosion, the woman with steady hands, the Spanish lullaby. Harding's voice didn't ask. It commanded. "I need to speak with Major Rachel Torres. Now. Not in 5 minutes. Not when it's convenient. Now." The head nurse at the station looked up. Blinked. "I'm sorry, sir, I don't have anyone by that name on the." "Then find the records." The employment records. The file from her temp agency. Someone in this hospital hired her 8 months ago, and I need her location as of 6 a.m. this morning. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the kind of certainty that made people move without thinking. Marcus stepped forward. His eyes were red-rimmed, his voice steady but barely controlled. She's a major, sir, I'd know her anywhere. He gripped the four-pole. The temp nurse in the ICU. The one who argued about my admission. Dark hair. Scarred hands. She saved my life in Kandahar 20 years ago during a compound collapse. She saved my life again 2 days ago when Dr. Caldwell tried to discharge me. That's her. That's Major Rachel Torres. The room went dead silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere down the hallway, a ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The head nurse's hands trembled as she pulled Rachel's file from the computer system. I can call the temp agency. Her last shift was Thursday. She left a forwarding address in Oceanside. A motel. Harding nodded once. He pulled out his phone, made a single call to someone with the call sign Nightcrawler, and specified coordinates. Then he turned to the head nurse. Has Dr. Caldwell been informed of the earthquake situation? Is he here? He's in his office. Administrative leave as of this morning. There's an FBI agent upstairs, But Harding was already moving. He walked to the administrator's office on the 4th floor with Marcus following, still in a hospital gown, and when he pushed through the double doors, he placed a folder on the desk with the kind of finality that ended conversations before they started. Major Rachel Torres. Army Medical Corps. 16 years of active service. Harding's voice was level, clinical, the voice of someone reading a classified document. Silver Star for Valor under fire. Bronze Star with Valor for extraordinary heroism. Purple Heart. Second Purple Heart. He paused between each medal, letting them land like weights. She ran a combat surgical unit at forward operating base Bagram that maintained a 96% save rate under sustained fire. 96%. That means when people were bleeding out in the middle of an active firefight, when soldiers were drowning in their own blood, she kept them alive. Those are the statistics you're looking at. He placed his hand flat on the folder. And you fired her. For saving someone's life during a natural disaster. The administrator, a woman named Sarah Klein whose face had already gone pale, said nothing. She reached for the folder with trembling hands. The FBI agent arrived 20 minutes later. Special Agent Louis Reeves, mid-50s, with the kind of weathered face that came from 30 years of digging through other people's crimes. He set up in a conference room with 2 forensic accountants, and they opened the surgical records of Dr. Caldwell spanning 6 years. What they found made grown men go quiet. The pattern emerged by 8:15. Unnecessary spinal surgeries on elderly patients covered by Medicare. 14 procedures that had no diagnostic basis. Kickbacks from a device manufacturer called Orion Surgical Solutions, $340,000 over 4 years, deposited into shell accounts in his wife's maiden name. Falsified patient outcomes coded into the hospital's surgical ratings. Exploratory procedures billed as definitive surgeries. Hardware marked as implanted when the surgical notes showed it was never used. He had been steering patients toward high-cost interventions they didn't need, padding his statistics, and padding his bank account with every unnecessary cut. Dr. Caldwell sat in his office downstairs, still not understanding what was happening, when the State Medical Board called at 9:30. His license was suspended pending a full hearing. His attorneys arrived by 11 o'clock, 2 of them, expensive suits and leather briefcases, but the evidence was digital. Time-stamped. Impossible to explain away. The surgical board investigation he had triggered against Rachel Torres, the complaint he'd filed within hours of the earthquake to destroy her credibility, had become a crowbar that broke open his entire practice. He had tried to demolish her, and in doing so, had knocked the first domino that would bring down his empire. His face went ash-gray when the administrator explained it to him. The investigation into your complaint against Major Torres triggered an internal audit. We found she didn't finish. She didn't need to. His attorneys were already reading from the forensic accountant's report, and with each page, Caldwell's breathing became more shallow. By Friday afternoon, he had been placed on administrative leave pending termination. By Monday, he had been offered a choice: resign immediately with a non-disclosure agreement and a settlement, or face 17 felony counts. He chose the settlement. And when that settlement was finalized, he was given a final offer: disappear quietly or watch the media crucify him. He disappeared quietly. The interrogation of Rachel's employment file revealed only 8 months of history and references that were all disconnected numbers. But when Commander Harding made a single phone call to the Pentagon, the classified records were unsealed. Not all of them; some files would remain locked away for another decade, but enough. Enough to confirm that Major Rachel Torres, Service Number 48 GA 2894, had served with distinction. Enough to show that her medical records from Kandahar matched Marcus Chen's description exactly. Enough to vindicate her completely against every accusation Caldwell had made. By Thursday morning, Rachel was located at a motel in Oceanside, room 212, where the cardboard box containing a cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse," a dying succulent, and a photo of her surgical team still sat on the dresser beside a single dog tag on a broken chain. Commander Harding arrived in person at 9:15. He knocked. She opened the door in scrubs because she had nothing else to wear. He handed her a folder: DD 214 restored, rank reinstated, formal apology from the Department of Defense, and an offer to reinstate her commission. She read it once, set it down on the dresser next to the dog tag, and asked only, "The others from Bagram?" Harding's expression softened. "We're working on it." "How long?" "Could be months. Could be years." Pentagon moves slow. Rachel nodded. Asked, "Chen?" "Wants to meet you. Says he's been looking for you for 20 years. Harding smiled slightly. "Kid's in good health. Early myocarditis, caught in time. Says if that nurse hadn't pushed so hard, he'd probably be dead right now." He paused. "Says if you hadn't found him in Kandahar, he'd have bled out in the dirt." Rachel picked up the dog tag. "Read the name engraved on it." Her name. Not the false one. Her real name. The one the Pentagon had erased. The one she was allowed to wear again. 8 months later, she stood at Naval Base Coronado in dress uniform, Major Rachel Torres, oak leaf rank insignia on her collar, every medal in its proper place. The State Medical Board had closed the case against Dr. Caldwell with 17 felony counts. He pleaded to 8. Seattle General settled with 12 patients he'd harmed. Dr. Patel kept her leg and returned to residency, asking Rachel to speak at her graduation about the nature of calling, about the cost of speaking truth. That was for later. For now, there was Marcus Chen waiting in a conference room that smelled of coffee and metal polish. He was 28, broad-shouldered, the bearing of someone who had found his tribe and learned to live with purpose. When he saw the major's insignia on her uniform, his eyes well up. "I never forgot you," he said. She nodded. "Once. You were brave." They talked for an hour. About Kandahar. About the earthquake. About the years between. He gave her a photograph he had somehow kept through everything, a younger version of herself in dusty fatigues, kneeling beside a supply cache, her face barely recognizable under the dust and exhaustion. She tucked it in her pocket next to the dog tag that finally had her real name. On her way out of the hospital later that day, she passed through the lobby of Seattle General. The night security desk was staffed by a man in an ill-fitting uniform, his shoulders slumped, his eyes on a logbook. Dr. Caldwell looked up as she passed. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. His dropped immediately back to the page. He was 18 months into 18 months of night shifts, the settlement's final stipulation. The man who had ruled this building from his office, who had invented derogatory nicknames and made careers evaporate with a phone call, was now logging the time, his empire reduced to a clipboard and a name tag. Rachel didn't stop walking. But her hand brushed the dog tag beneath her collar. The one with her name. The one that said she had existed. The one that said she had mattered. Outside, Commander Harding waited by a car. "The DoD wants you back," he said. "Instructor position at Fort Sam Houston. Train the next generation of combat medics. 48-hour notice." Rachel considered the offer. Thought of the photo in her pocket. The years invisible. The dog tag finally bearing truth. "I'll think about it," she said. She got in the car. As they pulled away from Seattle General, Harding said quietly, "You know what they say about people like Caldwell. They only have power in the light. When the crisis hit, when it mattered, he folded and you stood." Rachel watched the hospital recede in the side mirror. She saw Caldwell's silhouette through the glass, bent over his logbook, a man erased by the very system he had tried to weaponize. She replied with the kind of certainty that came from having already survived the worst, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." The car turned onto the freeway. Behind them, Seattle General's lights burned bright against the evening sky. And in the security office, a disgraced surgeon logged the time, his pen moving with mechanical precision, 18 months still stretching ahead of him like a sentence that had no parole date. Her story was just beginning again. If you've made it this far, you know what it means when a quiet person finally speaks. Subscribe, like this video, and let me know in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?